to this afternoon's session, and thank you for joining us for the graveyard session of lockdown day 13. I'm going to talk to you about dealing with uncertainty in loss of earnings matters. So this is me sometime before self-isolation, as you can perhaps tell from the video. I can't see myself on video right now, but yes, that was me some days before self-isolation. I'm an actuary and I've worked at Munro Actuary since 2009 with a 2-year gap overseas, and I returned in 2012 and since then been full-time. On the agenda today, I'm going to be talking about contingencies, direct versus indirect losses, pension and other benefits, actuarial assumptions in uncertain times, and then a Q&A at the end. Laki Choi will be assisting me with answering questions. He's almost qualified with a particular focus on coding and has worked at Munro Actuary since 2015. So he's just available in the background to help me answer any questions if I miss them. Then just some housekeeping. Everybody is muted to prevent delays in buffering, but you can type questions in the Q&A or use the chat section at any time or at the designated time at the end. We will answer the questions at the end, time permitting, and we'll also send out via email afterwards. Also a reminder that there will be a quick survey when we leave, and we'd appreciate your feedback if you do have a moment. All right, so the first topic being contingencies. So I'm just going to start off by some quotes from case law and the Koch thesis that we've seen. So the first one, it's uncertain circumstances of a positive or a negative nature. This cannot, of course, be assessed on any logical basis. The assessment must largely be arbitrary. So quite uncertain, you know, the remark there, how to deal with it in practice. Reduction for contingencies will increase with the lengthening of the period of risk. We suggest a formula of 0.5% per year of working life for a person with only moderate job stability. And we'll take a look at that in some slides later as well. Then the court remains of the opinion that statistics should not be regarded as the only determining factor. But that's maybe the only determining factor that us as actuaries can help you with. So I'm going to be looking at some stats as well. So ultimately, it's a decision for the legal parties or the court. There's no expert that can definitely say what the appropriate contingencies are. Standard RAF contingencies are widely used, but there's no mathematical reason for them. And the best expert to advise on uninjured contingencies could perhaps be the earnings expert, seeing that they assess the claimant and the career and and the industry that the person is working in and so forth. So they are perhaps the best placed, but still maybe without the statistical type insight that I'm going to share with you today. So here's some typical factors to be taken into account. It's quite a long list. I'll just go through a few of them and talk in some more detail. But the obvious ones being employment history or being unemployed at the date of accident, or even being a minor, with no career history, and perhaps uncertainty in terms of what what level of education they might achieve. This can all compound the level of uncertainty. Then whether we're looking at basic salary or also fringe benefits and growth on the earnings. Typically overtime and commission earnings are subject to much greater risk than the basic salary. Disability income, severity of the accident, government workers. Just some notes on government workers. It's unlikely that the government will reduce the income of a disabled person, given that they are not profit or performance driven to the extent of privately owned businesses. Also, they have generous ill health benefits are available on medical boarding, and certain benefits like medical aid, subsidies, and homeowners allowances are unlikely to be affected by the accident. And in practice also, notch increases we've seen mostly still happens after the accident as well. Then the the age and the length of future working life, as I've discussed, the typical rule of thumb being 0.5% per year to retirement. The level of qualification, the location, possible early retirement, possible early death, promotions lost or delayed promotions. So all these last few that I've mentioned, I'm going to show you some stats in the next few slides. And then just a note on them that must exercise care that the impact of the accident is not brought into account twice. Once by way of an explicit allowance for reduced earnings, for example, early retirement or, no promotion, would be explicit allowance, and then also again by way of contingencies. So, for example, the severity of the accident, if that's already been taken into account in a much lower injured career being postulated, then perhaps the severity of the accident shouldn't also be accounted for in a higher contingency, because it will then be a double deduction essentially. Okay, so the next few slides all comes from the Stats SA website. This one shows the unemployment rate by education status for almost the last 10 years. You can see it's relatively stable over time, but with a big level of variation by education status. So you can perhaps also see, a slight upwards trend. As we know, the last few years have been quite tough, but on the 10-year graph, it's not that evident. Even the lines are slightly upward trending, but perhaps not by much. I think but the distinguishing factor being the differences in the level of education. So roughly in the middle of the pack is the light blue line. So that's I'm not sure how clearly everybody can see, but that's all of South Africa. So that's the average for the whole country. Then at the very bottom is graduates, the green line, and then just above it, the purple line is the other tertiary courses, and then slightly above the average, the national average is matric, and then at the very top, the blue line is the less than matric. So it's quite clear that level of education has a significant impact on the unemployment rates, and so therefore should do in terms of the contingencies being considered as well. This slide shows the same story roughly for the level of education, but also shows a further split of age groups. So it shows that irrespective of the level of education, the younger members of the population experience far higher rates of unemployment than the older population, and I guess that's evident also from the fact that older people tends to have experience, so so they are more likely to maintain and find employment when they lose employment. This just shows the variation by province. Again, a large variation, with Western Cape being almost the lowest, Limpopo slightly lower even at the very bottom. So it plays a big role, but the claimant may not be as restricted by where they live, the location, as they are by the level of education. So so it's not that clear, whether this should be taken into account, but it's, I suppose, worth being aware of at least. And then the next few slides all, essentially does the same. It's a progression calculated at 5,000 per month at the date of accident in 2019 terms. The progression straight lines then to a 10,000 per month at age 45, and then earnings inflation until age 65. If the person is already above 45, then it's only earnings inflation on the 10,000 until retirement. So for each slide, we've then calculated what the contingency differential will be that give you the same loss as the factor being tested. So for example, this first one, 5 years early retirement, is worth a certain amount on a certain claim for a certain age. And if we don't do the 5 years early retirement, but test what level of contingency differential gives us the same loss. So what this shows here is that for a current age of 30, on this example that I've explained, the 5 years early retirement is worth about 10%. So it's interesting to note that, that's roughly or not roughly, that's exactly the level of the difference in the standard RAF contingencies, where they typically apply 15 and 25 to the uninjured and injured incomes respectively. So it's interesting to note that the standard differential really only accounts for somebody age 30 and only for 5 years early retirement and for no other risks. And then as you age, the value of early retirement becomes a lot higher because it's much closer, so there's less mortality and discounting that reduces the impact of the early retirement. So for a young person age 20, you'll see the impact is only about just over 5%, and that's because it's very far away. So the capitalized value of the loss is not that big. So so then also for all these slides, you can basically interpolate between ages or scale up or down, to see other values. So for example, the value of 10 years early retirement at age 30 would be roughly double the 10, so roughly 20%. So it's basically just a guide, like I say, on this specific example of what it'd be worth. Obviously each case will be slightly different to this, but yeah, this is just an indication then. So for the next one, we look at the value of a 5-year delay in reaching the career ceiling at the various ages, and we only consider up till age 40 because the assumption is that the career ceiling is reached at 45 normally. So in this case, it's pushed out to age 50. So therefore, you can see a much smaller impact. So at age 40, the impact is the biggest, but it's still only 6% continuous differential is equivalent to somebody aged 40 reaching their ceiling at 50 instead of at 45. Again, if you want to halve these figures to get to a 2.5-year delay, then you can kind of like also see the rough impact that would have. Then a promotion lost 10 years from now. This was modeled on a 50% increase. So quite a large increase, but 10 years away, and a promotion, so it's not a straight line, it's a step promotion 10 years from now. So because of the big increase, you can see the continuous differential, that's needed to give you the same kind of impact is quite high. It's almost 25% for a 20-year-old. Here, the youngest person obviously has the biggest impact because they've got the longest career, after which the 50% increase will still apply. So somebody aged 50, they'll be promoted at age 60, and so therefore it's only 5 more years until retirement, at the higher level of earnings. Even so, that is worth almost 10% as a contingency at the 50% promotion level. Another common impact that we are asked about is, the future life expectancy. So obviously we allow directly for the chances of dying at the normal, the normal times given by the current life tables that we use. So this has already been allowed for, but here we are looking at an additional loading of 10%. So the future life expectancy is reduced by a further 10%. You can see the impact there is relatively small at most ages. Not necessarily something that you need to allow for explicitly. Perhaps contingency differentials here could be applicable. And then contingencies. Here's just an example of how we apply, past and future contingencies on the uninjured and injured earnings and the eventual impact on the loss. So they can apply on, like I mentioned, on the uninjured and the injured, also on the past or the future periods. They can be positive or negative, and I think what we mean by that is rather the factors that affect them can be positive or negative. The overall contingency probably won't. I've never seen a negative one myself, but there could be factors like if somebody's in a very stable job to consider smaller than a normal contingency, so that's a negative, like it's a negative adjustment to the standard contingency perhaps, and they can increase or decrease the claim depending on the relative sizes of the level of earnings. So in this example, you can see the future uninjured earnings is relatively big at 5 million. So even though the injured contingency is higher at 25%, it's taken off a much smaller injured future earnings of 1 million, and therefore the overall impact of the set of contingencies here reduces the claim. Then it's general accepted that there is higher contingencies on the injured earnings, but this isn't the only possibility though. Like I've mentioned, if the IP have suggested very high speculative uninjured earnings and very conservative low injured earnings, which means it's already been directly accounted for, then it might actually be reasonable to apply higher contingencies on the uninjured than the injured. Also, it's usually not appropriate to apply contingencies on the injured past because that's normally based on fact, although there is exceptions where this is not available. Okay, then moving on to the direct versus indirect losses, and linked to contingencies. How contingencies are then used to address indirect losses. So some examples of direct losses: the claimant is unemployable, you will retire 5 years early, will not reach the suggested career ceiling. So these are all direct losses, are all losses that we can calculate explicitly. And it is important though to note how the specific wording in the IP report will result in how it actually is calculated. So there's often quite a bit of uncertainty. And if we ask team members, how would you interpret this? If you ask 5 team members, you'll get 4 different answers perhaps. So that's one of the things where it's, we're often uncertain what the IPs mean. And then, some examples, the same 3 examples worded slightly differently might mean, that it might not be promoted, he might retire early, might suffer periods of unemployment. When we see these words in reports, we typically don't explicitly allow for it unless instructed by the attorneys. So when we see these kind of comments in the reports, then we typically set the uninjured and injured careers to be equal and assume that all losses will be addressed via contingencies. Like I've shown in the previous set of examples, depending on the age and the severity of the factor being considered, this could be quite an inaccurate way to account for the losses. So it is always best to calculate losses directly if possible. So an example of how we could still calculate the loss directly is for the claimant might retire early if the specialist, if one of the medical specialists, perhaps can put a chance on it. So for example, a 40 to 60% chance of the claimant retiring between ages 50 and 60, then we will calculate the average being 50% from age 55. So essentially the average of the percentage range and the average of the age range, and then at least there's something directly being calculated, and not all just left for contingencies. Okay, so graphically, it looks as follows. Most of you would have seen the earnings graphs in our reports. So essentially, the black line here is the uninjured, the gray line is the injured, and the gap between them is a graphical representation of the loss. And then the red line is the date of calculation. So in this case, you can see, there's no past loss. The black and the gray lines, overlap. And then there's a growth from, so this, this model was done on a 26-year-old female, accident in 2015, and the current earnings is 10,000 in current terms. And then in the uninjured, we're assuming growth till 20,000 at age 45, sorry, by age 50, and then retirement at age 65. And in the injured, we're assuming just inflationary increases until early retirement at age 60. So important to note here that earnings inflation, this graph is in real terms, so therefore the straight line, the injured, the straight line there means the earnings only increases by earnings inflation, and whereas the black line, the uninjured, you can see grows in real terms to 20,000, but also in today's terms. And then at the end, you can also see the early retirement, so the gray line stopping before the black line. So then this same picture, if we were to address it by an indirect loss, so might not reach the ceiling, might retire early, and we set the careers equal, then you can see there's no direct loss, and the loss will only be addressed via contingencies. The result of this particular example was as follows. So the direct loss gave almost 1.5 million, and the indirect, at a 10% standard differential yields only about 400,000. And as we've seen before, this claimant is 26, so, close to 30. So that's about, 10% really only allows for the 5 years early retirement and not, any of the other factors that might be at play. Okay, and then when we look at pension and other benefits, how do we limit the uncertainty when we have to calculate these benefits? So for pension, firstly, we usually estimate it as a difference in contributions between the uninjured and in the injured careers. We allow for tax breaks. Not all firms do, but the tax breaks are available, and we do allow for it, even if it's just a postponement of the tax. Also, to limit the period of uncertainty, we only consider the period from date of accident to retirement, which means we ignore funds and service accumulated before the accident. This situation often comes up in practice where after the accident, the claimant, loses his job, is in need of cash, and he, cashes in his pension fund that is accumulated at his previous job. So we ignore this because this was accumulated before the accident, and it was also available in his uninjured state. He could have just resigned and accessed his pension as well. So that's not money that's paid as a result of the accident. It's been accrued before the accident. So therefore, we only look at the accident until retirement date and the contributions made between those 2 points. That's the period where the accident affected the claimant's ability to earn. Again, the choices at or after retirement is very uncertain, depending on what type of scheme or fund you're in. You'll be able to access up to a third of your pension in lump sum, but you don't have to. With the remaining money, you could buy various types of annuities, increasing or linked to inflation or level, or living annuities with various fund choices and drawdown choices. So it's very uncertain what people would do at that age, and so therefore we don't consider this period typically. Again, rather focusing on the contributions that would have been made in the period while the person was working. So for the reasons mentioned above, then as well, when a defined benefit scheme like the government, we usually consider that as a defined contribution scheme. So rather choosing to value the contributions than choosing to value the uncertain impacts, before or after the period of the accident. This ensures consistency between claimants earning at the same capacity. So often, you'd find that government employees, when you account for all the benefits, they earn essentially at the same capacity as a private individual in a similar role, but that their pension is the government pension, which has defined rules. So if we treat it as per the defined rules, then it introduces inconsistencies between claimants that's essentially earning at the same capacity, and could, of course, at any moment move between jobs, from private sector to public, or vice versa. Also, it avoids a strange impact of the cap on lump sums. So again, taking the government as an example, if you retire early, then you get early access to your pension lump sum, which then shows up as a gain normally in our calculation, but gains are not capped. And then when you would have retired in the uninjured state, there's a large lump sum that's paid out, which is a large loss, and that's often capped. So we've seen some strange results where the cap has a very unintended impact on lump sums if you use a defined benefit method. And also it avoids the projection of 30 plus more years beyond age 65 to the advanced ages, where we're much less certain about mortality impacts and the like. Yeah, and then just quickly, perhaps just going to cover, the value of fringe benefits when we're not certain how to value them. If there's no collateral provided, but they're simply mentioned, then we can't. but and this is just the value, again, the same example as earlier, adding various fringes, how that would affect the loss that we saw of 1.5 million, in that one example. So, um, so adding the medical aid has a smaller impact because it's paid in both careers. The only difference there is the early retirement period where it's not being paid, so therefore that impact's quite small. And then pension and overtime, that's a larger impact because it's both on the bigger career and also for the period of for the career growth on the uninjured, and also for the period beyond age 60 where the person would still have worked in the uninjured state. So in conclusion, if these benefits are not stated, for example, we don't have pay slips or we don't have tax documentation, and then we often can't value these, and then the claim might be undersettled. And then just a brief one on the time value of money. So salaries are normally adjusted by inflation. We're assuming 6% per year typically. And this is just to show how 10,000 rands in 2015 terms would have grown to now to just over 13,000. Or likewise, if the person is currently earning 10,000, we'd be assuming in 2015 that they've earned about 7,500 by just adjusting for inflation. So again, if this is uncertain in the instructions or in the IP reports, then we have to make an assumption, and depending on which way the assumption goes, it can make, in this example, up to almost about 30% difference in the claim. So it can be very substantial. Okay, and then lastly, the actuarial assumptions in uncertain times. So the key assumptions that we make for loss of earnings is mortality, investment, and inflation, and then the net discount rate, which is essentially linked. It's a link between the inflation and the investment return, and therefore it's quite a lot more stable than either of those two before it, because they tend to move, in conjunction with each other over time. And so, will these need to be revised in light of current events? So, what's the impact of COVID-19 on mortality? Well, just to put it into perspective, the SA population, there's about 450,000 deaths per annum. Per year, this is about 30,000 from TB, 22,000 from HIV, and about 50,000 from non-natural causes. Or per day, expressed as a per day figure, 60 murders, 40 MVA, and 190 HIV-related per day, deaths per day. Also, it mostly affects older people, COVID-19 so far. So again, typically beyond the population that we'd consider in our calculation, because we only calculate until retirement age, like I've mentioned before. So so the long-term impact, at the moment, on mortality, we'd say is not clear, but it's very low. I mean, as of today, I think South Africa had only 13 deaths. So compared to the major causes, like I've mentioned there, it's still minuscule. Then there's obviously lots of uncertainty as to when, or if or when, a vaccine could arrive. Would we develop natural resistance? Would the virus mutate? So there's naturally a lot of uncertainty still, but at the moment, we're still confident that, the assumptions are still fine. Then looking at the economic impact of the investment return and the inflation, which then obviously affects the net discount rate. So far, it's no different from earlier market crashes. Typically the world every 5 or 10 years have seen some form of a financial crisis or a market crash, and this one seems to be no more, no different to any of the others. So again, looking at the long-term assumptions of 5+ years, we don't really see an impact. It's also impossible and impractical to revise investment assumptions after each major event. Just consider someone who invests a lump sum just before or just after a market crash. Clearly the one, if somebody invests at the peak and somebody invests, a week later at the bottom of the equity market, clearly they will experience very different long-term returns. But this is really unavoidable, and it's impossible to maintain this level of fairness between claimants because of the delays between settlements and calculation dates. This really won't be practical. So that's about it. So in conclusion, we find that our current long-term assumptions remain valid, but naturally, if we believe at any moment that they, that they need to be adapted, then we will, and we will obviously inform all our clients. And we are monitoring the situation. We're constantly, satisfying ourselves that our assumptions are still relevant. All right, so that's it for me for now. So if there's any questions, I haven't looked yet. I'm not seeing any at the moment, but the recording, just while you guys are maybe thinking about some questions or typing, the recording will be made available as well. Any questions afterwards, we could email as well. Some answers if you have any questions after this presentation ends. And we value your time and your business, and would appreciate your feedback after the session if you want to stay around. Still not seeing any questions or comments, but in the interim, that's my team, but looks like I wasn't working on this day.